Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the WTFinance podcast, where we talk to experts to help gain a greater understanding about what is happening in the world of finance, investing, and markets. So, in today's podcast, I'm happy to welcome Jonathon Karelse, CEO at Northfind Management and author of the recently released book, Histories of the Future, Milestones in the Last 100 Years of Business Forecasting, which is available on all platforms at the moment. So, Jonathon, thank you so much for joining the WTFinance podcast today.
Pleasure to be here, Anthony.
No problem. And what was your influence for writing the book?
Well, influence, there were plenty, and inspiration, really two things. One being pragmatism, and the other a lifelong desire for fame and glory. No, not really. I've been a forecaster for a long time, and I've always taken a relatively cautious and thorough approach to everything that I do. So I want to make sure that I understand things as deeply as I can. And it's usually not as deeply as I want to by the time I have to use it, but as deeply as I can before I'm forced to put critical skills into action. And one of the things that struck me over the course of my forecasting career was the number of things that we do as demand planners and even as senior managers that are sort of received wisdom. It's just, it's understood that we forecast for this reason. And it's understood that we forecast in this way. And I wanted to dig a little bit deeper and understand, why do we forecast, and why do we do the things we do when we are forecasting? And the inspiration for how to approach that problem came to me from a gentleman named Bruno Latour, who's a member of the Latour wine family. He's kind of commonly regarded as the black sheep because he's the one not making wine, but he has a PhD in, I believe, epistemology. And he wrote a book called Science in Action, which I read. I will date myself, so I'm just going to say a long time ago when I was an undergraduate student. And what Bruno Latour tried to do was to unpack a lot of the black boxed truths of science. He tried to unpack the ideas of capital T truth and all of the derivative science that follows from them, by reminding us that all of these things that are now, we believe, certainties, were at one point, and often not that far in the past, not even an idea. And then from that idea came a lot of human factors and social conditions and even happenstance that led to these things becoming black boxed. And what struck me was that in the understanding of how these truths came to be truths, we gained a lot more insight into how to practically and effectively deploy them. So I applied the same approach to forecasting. I wanted to understand, what are the processes that led to these big ideas in forecasting. And that's how I sort of landed on the idea of tackling, I think it ended up being 8 major milestones. I had ideas for a lot more. In some cases, when I began researching them, there wasn't much of an interesting story to be told. And in other cases, when I began researching them, even at this relatively late point in my career, I learned some dramatically new things.
Yeah, and that's really interesting. I think it just shows you how important sometimes looking back at history and the progress and how it's come along can actually teach you new lessons on how things work. Yeah, definitely. So for anyone who maybe doesn't know much about forecasting or what it is, can you maybe give a brief explanation of it?
I mean,
or longer if need be.
No. I mean, the brief version won't make any professional forecasters or demand planners happy, but I mean, it is what it sounds like. You're trying to guess the future, and that's where we often begin by falling down. I mean, to begin with, we can't predict the future. We can't. And even when we get pretty good at directionally guessing what sort of things might happen in the future, we're still not always right. So forecasting is basically, from a business standpoint, trying to predict what is going to happen along particular dimensions, often in terms of a demand for a product or demand for a service, or extrapolated from that, what financial outcomes are going to happen based on history that we've got, based on our assumptions of the current state, based on our assumptions of what's going to happen in the future. packaged together in varying degrees of scientific technique, and ultimately some sort of a guess at the future. But really, anyone who says it's something more precise than that fundamentally misunderstands what forecasting for the social sciences means. Forecasting in more scientific disciplines like physics, like when it comes to space or putting people on the moon, that's actually a lot easier, a lot more predictable to do than trying to predict what's going to happen in terms of business, because you're not stuck with the uncertainty and frequent irrationality of humans. You're just stuck with the laws of physics and the laws of science. And although in most cases we don't have a fully generalized understanding of why they are the way they are, we still have a much higher degree of certainty of what outcomes will look like, rather than when you try to predict what humans are going to buy tomorrow or 6 months from now.
Yeah, and I guess, our podcast is focused on investing, and when it's basically just probabilities. It's trying to understand the probabilities of the likelihood of an event to happen in the future. If that's yeah,
probabilities are key. Too many people in investing, in business forecasting, try to take a deterministic approach. And then it's a certainty you're going to be wrong. A point forecast for something with as much uncertainty as future stock performance, future business performance, future demand, it's crazy. So a probabilistic approach there makes a lot more sense. And then basically, if you can afford to play the long game, ideally, you should be able to monetize that.
Yeah, and I guess, we've seen in the past, I guess value at risk is potentially an example of analyzing the potential risks that a company could go through, which was found not to work too well, especially in 2008 with very complex banks. So I guess, do you think people trying to be too deterministic actually brings lots of fragility into systems and businesses? And
I think it's actually the first part of your question / answer, and that's properly assessing risk. I'd argue that 2008 wasn't the result of not adequately recognizing risk. There is a dimension of that, but I think at a derivative level, I think the people who were initially packaging CDOs and other derivative financial instruments were aware of the downside risk, which is exactly why you bundle them. By bundling, theoretically, you are mitigating some of that risk. So you're aware that there's risk there. I think it's just, it's human psychology. We've got a, contrary to what neoclassical economics wants us to believe, which is that there's a linear relationship between risk and reward. The reality is, and for your listeners who are fans of Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, they'll recognize this. It's asymmetric and nonlinear. So we've got a complicated and nonlinear relationship with risk and reward, and we're a lot more afraid of losing than we are a fiend to winning. And how that turns out in practical terms is we've got no problem baking upside into assumptions or models, but we really don't we're much more likely to gamble on downsides. So the possibility of a risk often gets gambled with in a model, whereas the possibility of an upside frequently gets baked in. There's a researcher named Paul Goodwin who used to be a management professor at the University of Bath, and he's still a professor there, emeritus. And he's been researching human judgment and forecasting for about 40 years. And one of the interesting things that he's tracked over time is that something like more than 80% of the time when humans try to intervene with judgment on a statistically driven forecast or model, we make it worse. So that's an interesting tidbit number one. We're not nearly as smart as we think we are. But number two, when we intervene, and our research with a number of large multinationals has borne this out, we're something like 3 or 4 times more likely to adjust up than down. So we love when the future looks good, and we have no problem telling a computer it's wrong when we want the future to look better. But when we're trying to account for risk, which is the thing we should be doing when it comes to overriding statistically driven models, we're not good at that. We try to convince ourselves that the likelihood of a risk is too remote to bother baking into the model.
And does that have an effect on the, I guess COVID, you could say, is a classic black swan event that people don't expect, does that have an impact on the fact that we've experienced maybe more than you'd normally expect over the past 10, 20 years, 30, 40 years? Or
more what? Disruptions or
yeah,
risk?
well, I guess, like Black Swan event is something that's just
Okay.
hasn't happened. Yeah, it hasn't happened in the past. So a lot of the times we have to use past data to actually project for the future, if you know what I mean. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and that's one of the criteria of a black swan. I mean, that past data can't predict it. This is why, and I actually spoke at the same conference as Taleb, who invented the idea of the black swan last December at the conference of the M5 competition, which is Spiros Makridakis's baby from 1979 when he had the first one. The idea being they want to create this sort of global opportunity for practitioners and academics to try the either leading edge or best practices in forecasting to see what works best in practice, not just in theory. And what everyone is talking about, or at least what Taleb and Makridakis and Goodwin are talking about now, is not how to milk the last percent out of your statistical model. I mean, quantitative analytics have come a long way in the last 10, 20 years, not least because we've got more computing power now than we ever did before. So it's easier. But that hasn't made us better at forecasting. And the reason it hasn't made us better forecasting is because we try to forecast things that we won't be able to predict, number one. But number two, to your point, the interconnected nature of the world economy, and not just through physical trade routes, but now the digital interconnectedness has both localized what used to be global risks, but it's also reduced the latency in reaction to these kind of inputs, because now instantaneously people everywhere are aware of what's happening everywhere. And there tends to be much stronger, I would argue, psychological reactions to what previously would have been just fundamental reactions. And I'm not sure if the number of black swans has increased, and I'll come back to that in respect of COVID in a moment, but certainly the amount of volatility has, demonstrably, measurably increased. There's no question of that. Now, COVID as a black swan is an interesting case. Certainly, it does not pass the test that nothing in data or history could have prepared us for it. And why I argue that is because in the last 20 years alone, we've had avian flu, we've had swine flu, we've had Ebola, we've had Zika, H1N1, H1N5, SARS. I'm undoubtedly missing some. Now, none of these blew up to the point that COVID did, but certainly some of them had a much higher mortality rate, and could have. And a lot of companies that have used COVID especially early on, as an excuse for not being prepared for instance, critical shortages of PPEs in healthcare, or the potential of supply disruption or key componentry disruption, I think is utter nonsense. Because from a risk management standpoint, we've had way too many data points just in the last 2 decades that say, listen, we're getting more populous, we're living closer together, and we've seen that increasingly pandemics can happen. We should plan for the possibility of another one happening. And we know what that has looked like. Countries like Singapore and Taiwan, who were impacted by SARS the first time around, reacted very well, and they weathered it relatively well. I think that the part of COVID that might qualify as a black swan isn't the event itself, but rather the way in which the world responded. You had people really reacting. And again, I go back to the interconnected nature of society now. It's so digital, it's so instantaneous. And I think when people began reacting, media, of course, felt a need to react. And once media began reacting, governments had the responsibility to at least appear like they were doing something. Now, I'm not going to go down the rabbit hole about what government responses were good or bad, but certainly I think a lot of government policy internationally was guided not necessarily by science, as many people are appropriating the voice of now, but rather the need to appear to be doing something to placate the billions of people who are talking about it. But the thing itself, a global pandemic, an airborne flu, by no means is this unprecedented at all.
Yeah, definitely. And you mentioned that sort of event, sorry, that you spoke at before. I know Taleb is
M5,
very, M5, is very well known for anti-fragile. So, creating these systems that become stronger when there's more volatility. Is that what a lot of people are talking about now? It's, as you said, it's not about trying to get as much growth as possible, trying to expand as much as possible. It's more building these systems that are, no matter what happens, they can keep going.
It should be, but unfortunately, there's the first 4 iterations of M. Well, let me back up. The first 3 iterations of M proved, although I put quotes around proved, but suggested strongly that in practice, simple statistical methods outperformed more complex methods in an actual practical application. And that sort of mirrored what George Box, the famous statistician and partner of Gwilym Jenkins, who the two of them came up with Box Jenkins. Some of your listeners will be aware of that one. It's one of the most famous time series approaches. He said all models are wrong, but some models are useful. And he went on to say, since all models are wrong, you should be employing parsimony in model selection. In other words, no matter what model you choose, it's going to be wrong. So don't choose a big, complicated one. Choose the minimum viable solution and run with that. And the first 3 M competitions definitely suggested it made sense. In fact, approaches which are derided by some of the academics as heuristics, like simple exponential smoothing or double smoothing or Holt-Winters, tended to outperform, at least in these competitions, Box Jenkins even. What we started to see in M4 was hybrid approaches. So approaches that used a hybrid of methods, and some of them employed machine learning, were starting to do better. And in M5, there was no question machine learning was the thing. Some detractors of the competition would argue that it's still not really necessarily a great indication of how these methods will work in practice, because the data being used in M5 was a huge dump of Walmart data. And not everybody has big volumes like Walmart does across its portfolio, and doesn't have the effectiveness of a Walmart promotion as well. Be that as it may, there's definitely a lot of evidence that machine learning, when used judiciously and effectively, is absolutely possible to make a robust statistical baseline forecast. But when I asked Spiros Makridakis on my podcast a couple of months ago, what's the number one most important thing that a forecaster needs to have or know to be effective, he said luck. And it's precisely because increasingly all this risk you're talking about undoes a lot of the benefit of being able to use history as, well, frankly, a naive predictor of the future. We need to understand some of the causality, number one, but even more so, we need to understand the domain. And I think it's only really when you understand the domain in which you're forecasting that you can begin to bake in some of the risk that allows you to make probabilistic judgments that are going to make you more effective over the long term.
Yeah, that's amazing insights. And I think the one thing that I've noticed is that we really, if you look at COVID, we won't go into the specifics, but people always want that yes or no. They want the right or the wrong. But as you said there, it's not always the case with many of these issues.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. So if we go to the book, I feel like we've talked about 20 minutes about all this other stuff, which is really interesting. But the book, you actually start at the beginning talking about sort of the starts of business forecasting, where it came about. So I'm not sure if you can explain more about that and how it sort of culminated. I think in 1929, there was like a few different figures who were really involved in it.
Well, I mean, one could argue it didn't necessarily culminate in 29. Business forecasting nearly ended in 29, and then sort of out of the ashes arose the more modern notion of it. But yeah, so the antecedents to modern business forecasting are surprisingly not very old. You'd think, because our ideas about mathematics go back thousands of years. Our ideas of statistics, well, don't go back actually that much further than business forecasting. We feel like they do, and some of the principles upon which statistics is built are certainly several hundred years old. But statistics per se is itself only about 100+ years old. Meteorological forecasting, although we've for a long time tried to predict what patterns of birds or changing winds or the color of the sun tells us, we really only got kind of scientific about that in the late 19th century. And the idea of predicting how businesses would do, or actually, and this probably is much more of interest to your listeners, how stocks would do, this only really started in the 20th century. And it wasn't a very scientific approach. I mean, most of the people offering their guidance or their stock picks were doing so on completely unfounded notions of what drove business movements. And they were frequently wrong. And they frequently had to come up with new reasons because without a more sophisticated understanding of monetary supply and market movements and a government framework for sort of damping down some of the naturally occurring volatility in markets, bank runs and market crashes prior to 29 were pretty common. I mean, they happened more than once a decade. And then I'm not talking about like, a bad day on the market. I'm talking about like nearly going to zero and having to start again. So there were people in this period with only just the beginnings of a modern understanding of how statistics worked, with, the idea of economics as a discipline in and of itself, or at least econometrics in the modern way that we understand measuring how economics works. This was a brand new idea. Irving Fisher got Yale's first PhD in economics with his thesis on monetary supply in this period. So we're talking about like into the first 30 years of the 20th century. So a lot of the principles upon which modern forecasting now rests as kind of second nature didn't really even exist back then. So we had a lot of folks being not that much more scientific than the prognosticators of the past who would read tea leaves or sands of grain on the beach, making money selling predictions. And really, that's what it was about. It was about the business of selling predictions more than it was about actually understanding what was going to happen. And what happened in 29, everyone should recall that the crash of 29, people got so wiped out at that point, including a lot of the prognosticators, that combined with the fact that economics or econometrics, statistics, the idea of forecasting, so borrowing concepts from meteorological forecasting, had matured to the point that in the wake of 29, people tried to understand what went wrong and how can we prevent this from happening again. So rather than just people popping up trying to figure out how to monetize this as an opportunity, we had actually government institutions trying to learn from this and apply science to the problem so we could avoid the kind of calamitous outcomes that we saw. And that sort of sets the stage then for important figures like Irving Fisher, who carried on with his econometric research. Roger Babson, I'll leave it to your viewers to read the book on him. He gets credit for having the crash right, but he'd been predicting a crash for 3 years. So, I think if you guess enough times, eventually you're going to be right. And he was right for the wrong reason. But apart from the two of them, most of the other folks sort of disappeared. And then from that point, it was services that built on the scientific work they were doing that put us in a much different position to try to understand future market movements.
Yeah, I guess you say Babson today would be like someone on Twitter posting a new prediction every day, and then once they get one
Yeah.
right, they delete all the delete all the
Yeah, I
other
mean,
ones
and
and keep that one.
Babson's legacy is he's got a very well-respected institution in Massachusetts named after him, but its focus isn't on prediction; its focus is on entrepreneurialism. So it teaches people how to build businesses and sell things, and that's what he was great at.
Yeah, definitely. And what, you mentioned there that you mentioned a few other points throughout history where forecasting evolved and there was some real key people involved in it. So can you maybe mention a few more of those that really stood out to you, and maybe how we got to where we are today?
Sure. So another couple of really important milestones on the way are the beginning of the time series methods that virtually anybody who has a forecast engine or demand planning tool relies on. So Robert Goodall Brown in the 50s came up with what's known as the grandfather of the time series methods. That was simple exponential smoothing. He invented that sort of by accident. He was I won't go too far into the story because I assume we don't have the time, but he invented it for the first time trying to sink Nazi submarines working for the US Navy in the 40s. And then in the 50s, when he began working, he was working for a consultancy that was doing work for the Navy at that point, and they were trying to predict material movements in their warehouses. So he was one of the fathers of early inventory management. He's actually one of 3 people who invented the SKU as well. And he figured that the algorithm he'd come up with to basically use it's called a ball disk integrator, which is a rudimentary form of mechanical calculator that they put on ships or bombers, that would take into account multiple different variables to predict what the most appropriate trajectory for a depth charge was, could equally be applied to a number of different variables in material movement. From that point, a couple of other gentlemen, one is Charles Holt, and then his student Peter Winters, came up with additional components to the same exponential approach. So in addition to just looking at a recency weighting index, which is what simple exponential smoothing uses, the Holt approach adds another component for trend, and then the Winters approach adds another component for seasonality. So basically, with recency, trend, and seasonality, you've unpacked the majority of a time series signal. So these were really, really important developments in business forecasting, and they all took place within a few years of each other in the late 50s and early 60s. The next, probably most important, it's tough to put a milestone here because this is basically a journey that's happening in parallel with business forecasting, and that's the advent of access to computing. I mean, computers per se had been around since the 40s. Some of your listeners are going to argue for the 30s. It depends what definition of Turing complete you're talking about. But in any case, computers had begun to arrive around the 40s, but like nobody had them unless you were cracking codes. But by the late 60s and early 70s, access to mainframes was widespread enough that you now had people selling sort of semi-automated versions of these time series algorithms that I was talking about. And then by the early 80s, with the advent of the PC and personal computers in corporations, it was now possible for many, many more people to make use of these statistical methods in day-to-day business. From that point, it's, we've made some progress statistically. We've made some progress on the machine learning front. I think the area that's probably still the least developed and most full of promise is really in understanding how human judgment is best applied to forecasting. And I argue that not just because of in cases like COVID, where you can no longer really use history to predict what's going to happen over the next few months, or it's obvious you need some sort of business intelligence. But even if we're in a steady state environment, even once the dust from COVID settles and we can turn back to time series methods, and even if we had a demand planning process or a predictive process driven by machine learning, there are still human fingerprints all over it. There's human fingerprints in data selection, in algorithm creation and selection, in parametric adjustment, and ultimately in the action that we decide to take from that process. And really having a thorough understanding of how humans make decisions, why they make decisions, what the unconscious drivers are of some of these decisions, I think is an even more powerful insight than, if we can come up with another time series method that gets us even, another 1% of the residuals that the most advanced pre-existing method is able to capture for us.
Yeah, it's amazing. Do you think something like that would ever be possible? It seems like it'd be
I
quite
mean,
complex.
I think behavioral economics is bringing us a long way in the right direction. I mean, a lot of our pre-existing notions of how people make decisions. I mean, look at fund managers, for instance. The idea is that fund managers have this sort of like this domain knowledge, this expertise, and they're able to, through the application of their judgment and their wisdom and their experience and intelligence, put together packages of financial instruments or equities that either effectively hedge against downside risk and provide consistent upside returns, or consistently outperform the market, or et cetera, et cetera. Whatever way you want to try to sell it, you're not going to find a fund manager who consistently over time outperforms the market. And at any given point in time, you can ask the top fund managers what their philosophies are, and they're all different, which is very interesting, because if markets are based on fundamentals, beginning even before we talk about demand and supply, but the idea that humans are rational actors who, when faced with value-based distinctions in choices, will choose the one with the greatest utility to them, or the one with the greatest value to them. It shouldn't be that complicated. I mean, it is, but it shouldn't really be that complicated. But we still always get it wrong. And why is that? Well, because the neoclassical definition of how we make judgments that are predicated on this objective, rational insight into the relative values of choices doesn't hold up in reality. For any of your viewers who have studied economics, they'll know that when we have people that don't fit our econometric model, we call them irrational. The problem is we're all irrational. We're all constantly being impacted by all these unconscious drivers. And that's what Tversky and Kahneman in the 70s, and later Richard Taylor, both of these guys, by the way, won Nobel Prizes for economics, even though in the case of Kahneman, he'd never even taken an economics class. He's a psychologist. These guys really tried to unpack, why do humans do the things that we call irrational that just don't fit, for instance, the expected utility theory, that we're so terrible at intertemporal discounting. We're so terrible at mental arithmetic. Even the smart ones of us are. And I think this is one of those endeavors that's probably ultimately asymptotic. I think, we can make a bunch of progress, but we're never going to understand the totality of the human brain. I mean, it's the most complicated structure in the universe. But I think we've made great strides in the last couple of decades in understanding the distinction between the neoclassical approach to decision-making and then a behavioral economic understanding of decision-making, one that is rife with these unconscious drivers. And I think if more organizations spent time trying to measure and modify the judgments that are taking place, rather than turning loose teams of data scientists and quants at trying to milk the last possible ounce of value out of a model, I think there's a lot more opportunity on that front.
Yeah, definitely. It's almost like, rather than having this baseline of rational people, we should just treat everyone as rational.
Exactly.
Make the system, yeah,
exactly,
better. So, when you were researching the book, were there any like surprising things that really stood out to you, or that took you by surprise, or
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of chapters that didn't make the book because the story that I thought I knew about them turned out to be completely both A, incorrect, and B, boring. So I didn't add that to the book. I think, there's a couple that stood out. The story of Robert Goodall Brown and simple exponential smoothing is a pretty interesting one. And further, like, I had no idea that he'd originally tried to sink Nazi submarines with simple exponential smoothing, although in his first iteration it was for continuous variables rather than discrete variables. But this other received truth that, if you're using simple exponential smoothing, an optimal alpha is 0.1. And no one can really tell you why that is. They'll say something about, a balance of recency without ignoring the past too much. In point of fact, having interviewed a few people who actually worked with him and seen some of his original writing, it turns out that Robert Brown suggested an alpha of 0.1 because there were no computers back when he invented it. And an alpha of 0.1 meant that he just had to move the decimal one place to the left for all of his index calculations. That was it. Like, nothing more scientific or insightful than that. And for 6 decades, people have dutifully been assuming that an alpha of 0.1 is the best way to use simple exponential smoothing. There's all kinds of little gems like that.
It's just amazing when you look back at it. You think there's this reason for all this stuff, and you're like, no.
Oh, there is.
Yeah,
there
exactly.
Is. But the foundations that so much of what we've built since then rest on are much more tenuous than we thought they were.
Yeah, definitely. It shows you the importance of looking back and understanding it.
Absolutely.
To see how valid the structures are. So we've talked about sort of the past and how we've gone into today. In the book as well, you talk about maybe the future of business forecasting, what it could look like. So I'm not sure if you can explain more about that. Is it more just what you said previously?
I mean, I think I know enough about forecasting to not put a forecast down on paper. I think we're seeing exciting things with machine learning, and that's not going to go away anywhere. And I think we're seeing exciting things in, I kind of hesitate to say this because it's a hackneyed phrase, but the democratization of machine learning. And what I mean is it's for better or worse, it's no longer the domain of hardcore data science. I mean, there's open source libraries, there's great documentation out there that gives people of every level of experience a good understanding of how to get into R or Python and applying some of these libraries to the forecast processes in their companies. I say for better or worse because I think, having greater access is a great thing. I think one of the mistakes that we make often is thinking that we can ever displace the need for a robust understanding of the mathematics, and I think that's dangerous. I think the future of forecasting for a lot of organizations is going to end up with cataclysmic failures when they go too far in the direction of trying to downplay the need for domain knowledge, downplay the need for judgment, and downplay the need for a robust statistical or mathematical background when employing machine learning. And they're going to learn that on the math front, it is a complicated thing that requires training. There's no way of getting around that. You can probably get away with it for a while. Like, you could probably get away with flying a Boeing Dreamliner for a while too, because they're so smart. But when something happens where you need to know what you're doing, it's going to be a big problem. I think because of the risk we've been talking about, Anthony, because I think, despite the fact people are talking about reshoring and not, nearshoring and localizing risk, it made for some good articles during COVID. It's not happening. People are still always going to be motivated by cost. And if they can get things at a cost and with a consistent timing and consistent service level, I think that's going to trump a lot of other considerations. Should it? Not necessarily. I mean, I think people need to bake in risk, certainly. But I don't think the future is going to look that different from where we're at now. I think for that to happen would have to mean dramatic rethinking of how we evaluate risk, which would be difficult because, like I said, we don't like to think about risk. We like to gamble with it. We like to think about good things and bake them into the plans and forecasts, but we don't like to do that with the bad things. I think for the future to look different, we need to get a lot better at judgment. We need to get a lot better at understanding how we make judgments, measuring them, measuring it, the unconscious biases that impact our judgments, and pairing that judiciously with all of the advances we're seeing in mathematics and statistics to create a robust baseline. Yeah, apart from that, though, there's no way I'm going on record as like making clear predictions about what the future of forecasting looks like.
Yeah, it's a fool's game, isn't it? But I'm surprised there hasn't been more onshoring, as you said, because as you mentioned, it's everything that people have been talking about, trying to increase the stability of supply chains and what's happening. You haven't experienced that.
I mean, well, let's be clear. I think supply chain stability is something that, I mean, COVID has definitely highlighted the need for having better buffers baked in. Too many people have been exposed by running razor thin. Too many people have been exposed by not even measuring some of the key foundations of their supply chain. I mean, you'd be amazed the number of companies we work with that when they're making a constrained supply plan, or theoretically making a constrained supply plan, are doing so on an assumption of perfect raw material or componentry delivery. So the only thing they're looking at is, do I have machine capacity to manufacture this? They're assuming the raw material is always there on time. That's crazy because, I mean, look what's happened over the last 2 years. I think getting a lot better at the other levers of supply chain, like getting better at inventory management, getting better at accounting for supplier side risk. I think there's definitely a lot of opportunity in the next few years. I think that will look different than prior to COVID. But the way that we forecast, the way that we start that demand, that supply chain with the demand signal, I don't think that's going to look dramatically different.
Yeah, it's interesting. So you think less, just in time, a little bit more inventory, but it's not going to be a massive change. Is that what you think?
Yeah, I think it depends.
I guess
what I'm hoping changes, and I don't imagine it will for a lot of people. They're saying it's going to change, but who knows? In 2019, Ernst & Young surveyed, I mean, they survey everything. But one of the surveys they did was a survey of senior level executives on risk. And something like, someone will fact check me, and please do, because I've used this misquote many times. But it's something like 80% or more of the senior executives they spoke to said risk management and business continuity planning were top priorities for their enterprises. That was in 2019. And then March 2020, it was clear that talk is cheap. And I think we're going to see the same thing. Like there's some people who are going to learn from this. They're going to learn to be a lot smarter with strategic inventory. So not just finished goods inventory, but multi-echelon inventory optimization. Where is my risk? Where's my volatility? At what level should I hold my inventory? Should I hold it at raw material level? Should some of this be held at work in progress? Should some of it be held at finished goods? And that's predicated on a deep understanding of your supplier performance, of the risk that's inherent to your supply chain, and of your own capabilities. And I think that's one of the things that's been missing, like a really objective picture of how capable are our supply chains really? Because a lot of people prior to COVID had this idea of what they could produce in terms of what the theoretical machine capacity they had was. But that was based on perfect labor availability and perfect raw material availability and perfect final mile delivery. I hope it's woken up people to the many more layers of risk that are there and the need to bake that risk into probabilistic models when coming up with their buffering strategies. Yeah, but again, I don't think a lot of people will.
Yeah, I think it's like, us consumers as well, we used to think that if you go to a supermarket, you should have everything available. We realize that's not the case. So I think it's, similar thing. But Jonathon, thank you so much for joining the What the Finance podcast. And I guess my last question, what is one message you'd like viewers to take away from either our interview or the book?
I guess for those of you who are practitioners, or for anyone thinking of being a practitioner, recognize that no one can predict the future. Recognize there's things that you probably shouldn't even bother trying to predict. And when you find yourself in the position of having to predict the future, recognize the limitations of that prediction. You should never be calibrating, or rather predicating a corporate strategy or a supply chain strategy on the need for a perfect forecast, because you will always fail.
Great message to leave the viewers with. So, Jonathan, thanks again. We mentioned your book, which is available, I think, on all platforms. I'll put it in the link descriptions below. If anyone wanted to see or hear more of your work, where would the best places for that be?
Well, my consultancy is at www.northfind.com, or I've got a personal site as well, jonathankarelse.com, where people can learn more about the book, read the book if they want to, or at least order the book. And I can be reached through the email on our website as well. Happy to answer any questions.
Yeah, perfect. So, Jonathan, thanks again for your time.
Great. Thanks, Anthony.
Thank you so much for listening. And if you enjoyed the episode, please subscribe and click the bell icon so you are notified when new podcasts are released. I hope you're leaving with some great value about investing, trading, and finance. See you on the next show.